Good afternoon. I am Dr. Heather Cateau. I'm a lecturer at the History Department at the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus. I'm supposed to be the chair for this panel, but I've just been fired. I am going to become an informal panelist. We are honored to have our Vice Chancellor with us, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles. It's always a pleasure. It relieves me because I was supposed to introduce the topic of reparations, but who better to do it than Sir Hilary Beckles? So he also has a flight at 6 o'clock, so he would not be able to stay with us. So we're going to start, and then I will informally join the panel.
Thank you so much, Heather, for your kind introduction. Now, this is going to be brief. I'm told I have 15 minutes. Now, I did promise Fidel Castro many years ago, I promised him that I will not allow anyone to break his record. And if someone does, I will break it in response. The longest speech in the history of the Caribbean, Fidel spoke for 6 hours and 15 minutes. So forget the 6 hours for now. I will deal with the 15 minutes, okay? Okay, good. So, reparatory justice. What I will do is to make 10 flashpoints. I call them flashpoints in the development of what is now, what was the Caribbean, now a global reparatory justice movement. And I will make 10 flashpoints around the areas that are controversial, very discursive. So I began with the concept of reparatory justice as a DEI project, okay? And by DEI, I'm referring to dignity. I'm referring also to existence. And I'm also referring to our collective intelligence. And I say that because people who have been enslaved have a special attachment to the concept of dignity, okay? So it's reparatory in that sense. Then there's the issues of existence. Enslavement challenged our existence as a people. It is often forgotten that, for example, the British brought 3 million Africans into the Caribbean. 3 million. And at emancipation, there were only 800,000 left. 800,000 people survived of the 3 million who were brought. My own island of Barbados, they brought 600,000 into Barbados. 600,000 into Barbados. What's the population of Barbados today? 250,000. How many were at emancipation? 83,000. How do you reduce 600,000 people to 83,000? You're talking about a genocidal process, okay? So we have to discuss that. At the Durban Conference in South Africa in 2001, when the UN put together the first global conference on reparations, the Americans pulled out and they said, listen, we're not discussing reparations with anyone. It's a domestic matter. We're not having no global conversations on this matter. The European Union threatened to pull out if reparatory justice was on the agenda. And the Western Bloc, ironically, the Western Bloc, Japan, Canada, Australia, Hong Kong, not Hong Kong, Singapore, they all said, if it's on the agenda, we're leaving. The West African countries all said, that's fine with us. We're not supporting reparations anyway. So who were left? The Caribbean delegation was left. Everyone else had threatened to pull out. So I'm representing the Caribbean, and I gave my speech in which I said, well, you can all leave if you want to leave. You can all go. But guess what? This is going to be the greatest political movement of the 21st century. And that was 2001. I was sitting between Fidel and Arafat. We were seated alphabetically. Arafat, Beckles, Castro. And Arafat asks if that statement isn't a bit hyperbolic. And I said, no, 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 it's not. It is going to happen. And here we are today, 21 years later, 25 years later, and all over the world we are talking about it. The foundation principle, of course, is the concept of crime against humanity. That is the foundation, philosophical basis of the ask, the crime against humanity. And this is important because in legalese, that is where you begin. The answer to that is, but surely there was slavery everywhere. Everywhere through human history there was slavery. And the answer to that is, yes, of course there was. What is our response? But what happened in the Caribbean and then the Americas was a fundamental break from all notions of history of slavery in the past. This is a major disjuncture. What happened? Imagine a pool, a swimming pool. There's a shallow end and there's a deep end. Everyone was in the shallow end. India, China, Europe, they're all in the shallow end. And everyone had people in their societies who were classified as slaves. But what was the deep end? Something called chattel slavery. Had never happened before. That was new. That you could classify these subordinate people as non-human. Non-human. And institutionalize something called property, chattel, real estate. That is what was brand new. That was invented by the British in the Caribbean. And then, of course, all the other Europeans adopted this notion of the chattel principle. Then the chattel principle was aligned and assigned to women. It was assigned to black women. They were the carriers of the chattel principle. In other words, the legislation across the colonies said a child at birth takes the status of the mother. So, the mother is enslaved, her child is enslaved. It doesn't matter who's the father, that child was born enslaved. If a white woman had a child with an enslaved man, that child was born free because a white woman could not give birth to a slave child. And there's thousands of examples. I mean, if you look at the second population census of Barbados, 1715, there's a census. And in the parish of St. Philip and the parish of St. Joseph are 36 children who are described as ye offspring of white women and enslaved Africans. And the children, those mixed-race children, were born free. On the other hand, there were about 1,500 similarly mixed-race children born of white men and slave women, and those children were born into slavery. So the black woman is the carrier of the status of slavery. It is through her that slavery goes on from generation to generation to generation. So therefore, chattel slavery was gender specific. Then we come to the question of the CARICOM 10-point plan. What are we asking for? I was asked to draft up an ask. The heads of government says, Hilary, listen, could you put together an ask? And I scribbled very quickly 10 points that constitute the ask. And the first ask, of course, was the apology. Then a series of other acts. And the 10th point in that ask was debt, non-recognition, and cancellation. Because we were asked to fund our post-colonial development with debt. The colonial power says, you want independence, you can have it, but you're on your own go. I said, no, no, because Arthur Lewis had very skillfully written, as a young man, when he published that small little book in 1939, in which he said, Britain has had 200 years of unpaid labor from 10 million people. Compute that. 200 years. Free labor, 10 million people. Compute that. What is the monetary value of that today, and blah, and so on. And so we are now going to revise the 10 points, the 10th, that deals not only with debt calculation and non-recognition, but also to say equity in the age of AI. So how do we integrate the AI revolution into the ask? So we're going to bring it forward. Now, another flashpoint is that the CARICOM reparatory justice framework focuses on justice from the imperial colonizing nations. And it skillfully and arguably deliberately removed itself from the domestic ask. So we're talking to Europe, the governments, the corporations, the banks, the insurance companies, the universities, the churches, all of those slave owners we're talking to. But we're not talking about our slave owners right here in the Caribbean. The slave owners who have passed on their wealth and their property to their offspring. And in each Caribbean society, the richest people are the people who inherited the slavery capital, the assets. They're the ones who inherited it. Those are the ones who possess it. They are the contemporary owners of that wealth. But it's only a matter of time before the gaze shifts from the imperial to the domestic. And that is going to be an interesting conversation. And I suspect that at the moment, all of the governments are very keenly supporting the discourse in the European context, the global context. I'm not sure how they're going to respond when it turns inwards, but we will see. Now, then is the question of how do we look at our Indian, Asian community, who came in here to do the heavy lifting after emancipation. After emancipation, they brought 500,000 people from Asia, India, working class poor people who were colonized, and they put them on ships and brought them here to continue the work. Now, the legalese will say, but however, they worked in slave-like conditions, but they were not slaves because they were not property. They were not chattel. And that's the fundamental difference. So you can work and be treated like a slave, but you signed a contract to come. And therefore, there can be no parity there. However, we the historians, we also know, however, many of those Asian people were deceived. They were told X, Y, and Z. And when they got here, there was ABC. And they did not sign up for plantation slave-like conditions. So we now have a concept called deceptive indenture, that the British deceived those working class Indian people, and therefore they should also be in a category with eligibility for reparatory justice. That is a very divisive conversation, but my position is the history shows that people were deceived. Many of those Indian women were raped on those ships. Many of those ships that brought those Indian people here were reconditioned slave ships. They were repurposed slave ships, and it brought with that the culture of vulnerability. And we have documents to show that they plundered those women on their way to the Caribbean. So yes, we will see how that conversation goes. Then there's the question of emancipation. The British and the Europeans got a tremendous amount of goodwill out of their propaganda. Oh, we freed them. It was a moral upsurge of justice, and we freed all of these black people, and we should get credit for that. Okay? Thus the language of emancipation as celebration. Now, but let me tell you, you never read parliamentary speeches and use them as authority. The floors of Parliament are theatrical spaces where great, grand speeches are made. But if you really want to write history properly, forget the speeches in Parliament. Go and read the minutes of the subcommittees. Because each European government wants us to know, how much is this damn emancipation thing going to cost this country? Before we go and give legislation, how much is it going to cost? What are we going to forego? Set up a committee, some economists to go and run the numbers and get back to us. Okay, they ran the numbers in Britain. They got back and they said, okay, the 600,000 slaves in the Caribbean, their replacement value is 45 million pounds. So if we're going to free them, we're going to forego 45 million pounds. That is half of the national expenditure. So therefore we need a system of emancipation that enable us to lose nothing, but to gain. In other words, they didn't even want a win-win. They want to benefit from the legislation. So here was the deal. The model, we're going to give the slave owners 20 million pounds in cash. Okay, good. That's 20 million in cash. Okay, so we now have something called white reparations. Okay. Now, how are we going to pay the remaining 25 million? Oh, here's the strategy. After we free them, we're going to create something called the apprenticeship system. So it started at 10, then it went to 8, they changed the numbers, it went to 4. You work for free for 4 more years to work off that 25 mil. So the slave owner, he gets 20 in cash and he gets 25 in free labor. And that was the British model. In other words, when you run the numbers, the black people paid more for their freedom than the British government. So we had to pay half of that for our so-called emancipation. I said, it's the most racist legislation ever passed in the parliaments of Europe. Not only for that, because the British and the Europeans have been fudging the issue for 200 years. Are black people human or not? Are they human or are they just straight property? And they have been fudging it. But the emancipation legislation could not fudge it because they had to decide, if we're going to compensate the slave owners, what are we going to call that? There's only one kind of compensation: property compensation. If you're going to take away people's property, you have to give them. Listen, in my house in Barbados, the government took 10 feet of my land at the front of my house to expand the road. To make the road wider, they took away 10 feet of my garden. And they had to pay me compensation. But guess what? That was 20 years ago. I got the check last week. Okay. Now, but that's okay. Property compensation. Compensate property. Now I'm coming to an end. I'm on 8. So we now have something called white reparations across Europe. All the European governments paid compensation to the slave owners, and none paid to the enslaved. And the enslaved were there crying out, these people stole our labor. Every human being is entitled to benefit from the products of their labor, and they have stolen not only our labor, but our bodies. We want compensation. They sent petitions to the parliaments. We want compensation. So they were calling for it. The British government was very explicit. Hush. Hush. Your freedom is your compensation. So hush, or we will reverse. Hush. So we were hushed. But the Haitians were the ones who were not hushed. The French government, King Charles, sent his army 15 ships filled with 2,000 soldiers and 500 cannons. You pay for the property that you took from our citizens. There were 500,000 Africans enslaved in Haiti. And the value of that, you're going to pay us back, or we're going to war again. 150 million francs. The government agreed to pay. That became the model. So the Haitian model became the model that all the other Europeans put in place, which is black people want freedom, they pay their commercial value as a precondition. Now, finally, we come to this question of, but it was so long ago. It was so long ago. Why are we litigating something that happened 150 years ago? It's remote. The British Parliament, the British jurisprudence, they have a wonderful concept called remoteness. But the notion of remoteness doesn't apply if people have a living memory of it in their households. There are people in the Caribbean whose great-great-grandparents were enslaved and they're still living with it as a domestic reality, right? It's a reality. My great-grandmother was 106 years old when she died, but I was 5 and 6 when she did. But I can still remember her insistence that she was a Wolof and blah, blah, blah. I didn't know what Wolof was. I know now because I went to Senegal and lived among the Wolofs. And I did that in order to understand her. But not remote, very much part of our domestic history, domestic reality. So, finally, 10 points. What really is the ask? The ask is a big tent. And the American and the USA, the reparatory justice process, which is very deeply interwoven in the CARICOM process, the Americans are saying, we want cash in hand. We want cash in hand because we have living memory of the property they took from us, Jim Crow, what they did to us. They burnt our buildings, they burnt our businesses, they killed our children, they lynched us all over the place, strange fruit. All of that is part of our contemporary life, and we want cash in hand. Every family that had gone through that process, cash in hand. Now, we support them, but in CARICOM, our approach does not go that way. Our approach tends to be more collective community development. So the 10-point plan is more of a development plan. It's more about, yes, there are psychological issues, there are issues around the apology, there are issues around education, healthcare, and all of those issues. But broadly speaking, it is about social and economic development on a collective basis. So it's a dialogue between Caribbean governments and European governments around the issues of sustainable development. And at the same time, we are very supportive and encourage the American colleagues who said, well, that is fine, but each black family that has gone through this and can demonstrate it and prove it should be entitled. So we have two different approaches, but we work together. But ultimately, what is the objective? What is the objective looking into the future? 100 years, 200 years, look into the future. What are we all about? I would say that the reparatory justice movement at this moment is really a call for a new enlightenment. That slavery malarkey drove the world into its darkest possible place. The taking of millions of people in chains across continents, across oceans, creating this horrendous global notion of black inferiority, the subjugation of black people, the violence and the brutality. It took the human species in a very dark place. I think that is becoming clearer and clearer. And we need to get away from that very dark place. All of us want to see humanity in its best light. So we have an idealism, which is a new enlightenment which humanity needs desperately to survive all of this hatred and anger. We need an enlightenment. So the reparatory justice movement globally, I think most people who participate in it all over the world, who have been colonized, who have had their resources plundered beyond Africa, all across the colonized world. 85% of the world was colonized, and we all know what colonization means to various people. But the reason why it's a global movement because that pain and that suffering that the majority of humankind feel today, living through the toxic ideology of white supremacy, is a new enlightenment. And I think that is where all of this is intended to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles. There's nothing like hearing about history when it is being made from someone who is making it. So thank you. I am now going to do my cross-introduction panel contribution. I had prepared a brief introduction. I'm now going to try and extend it a bit. One thing you can be sure of, I would not go over time. When I started to think about this panel, resistance, solidarity, reparations, it is really about a journey around us as a people, as a region, and as an international community. We all have to confront the issue of reparations at some point. Then I put on my historian lens, and once I did this, for me, I see reparation in much the same way I see emancipation. Not as an official act, not as an monetary award, as important as those things are, not as an issue confined to any country, place, or time, but as a movement, as a process. They both have common components: resistance, community action, growing solidarity, and a long, protracted battle. They have both, to me, transcended time, and they both now shape our current space. Reparations should be conceptualized as the second part of the emancipation movement. This call for reparations has reverberated throughout this region from the point at which the enslaved persons were officially emancipated. The call for justice has been connected to development needs by the enslaved people themselves. This is therefore not a new call in 2026. Rodney Rowell reminds us that the demand for land and money by the formerly enslaved got the governor so concerned that he went to St. James because he felt he had to remove such thoughts from their minds. There were explosive actions in Warren Bay in Jamaica, 1865, in Tobago and Roxborough, 1876, and in several other territories. We call them riots, but they were really demands by a newly freed population for fair social, economic, and development plans. June Summer introduces us to John Quinlan in St. Lucia. He made the case in 1897, and I quote, "The British government knows perfectly well that the peasants are entitled to as much consideration as their masters received 50 years ago. Make your amends, Britisher." Explosive outbursts continued in this region throughout the early 20th century. It reached a crescendo in the 1930s. In the 20th century, calls for redress were made by working men's association, labor leaders, trade unions, the Garveyite movement, the Pan-African movement, the Black Power movement, the Rastafari movement. We had our intellectuals, C.L.R. James, Eric Williams, Sir Arthur Lewis, Walter Rodney. They provided evidence as well, very importantly, as well as a philosophical base for reparation. Their scholarship challenged prevailing conventions, demolished established academic paradigms, creolized our historical thinking, and grounded new pathways for development. At our independence in 1962, our Prime Minister, Eric Williams, made it clear that the golden handshake from Britain was not enough. It could not compensate from what was taken from us in the past, and it could not provide for our development needs in the future. In 1990, the Caribbean Reparation movement entered another phase. It increased in intensity and got a contemporary focus. Today, the movement is at a stage that I think will be recorded as decisive and symbolic. The contemporary movement is centered in the CARICOM Reparation Commission, established in 2013, headed by Professor Sir Hilary Beckles. Importantly, the members are drawn from a wide section of Caribbean society. The movement is revitalized and revolutionized. Connections are being made with our history of indigenous and African enslavement to stunted economic growth, to levels of economic development, to our health challenges. The academic work has been challenged. There's a growing body of work supporting increased levels and sources of profits from the slave trade and enslavement. Universities, institutions, organizations are conducting research into their past involvement in enslavement. Communities like the Highlands in Scotland are discovering direct links to Caribbean plantations and enslaved persons. Families are looking into their enslavement past and attempting to make repairs. We must admit that there is an awareness, a questioning at a personal level, a community level, an institutional level, a national level, and even an international level that we have not witnessed before. Something is changing. Diplomatic approaches have been intensified. However, it is difficult to move states. They only express deep sorrow, but I don't think that such words can conceal the reality of what is happening. We must be aware of what is unfolding before our very eyes. Let us understand that reparation has begun. It cannot be stopped. It is bigger than an act or a figure or a sum. Today, reparations has become the basis of a powerful contemporary movement. It is contentious, it has numerous dimensions, but it will shape the future. It is part of a struggle for meaningful decolonization and independence. It is the basis of understanding new approaches to development. It is the foundation of a call for justice in a world where inequity has impacted on us for generations. It transcends the Caribbean, Africa, and the diaspora. It has already shaped our present, and it will shape our future.